Okay, I think we're good. So off we go. As you all know, this is a continuation of our God is Good class, and I added a little parenthetical thought to the title, and He wants us to be good. God is good, and He wants us to be good. That's an excellent little summary. There's a number of excellent little summaries you could make of Genesis and the Torah in general. That would certainly be one of them. And tonight we're, as soon as we wrap up just a smidge of items on Jacob, which we didn't get to last time, we're going to dive into Joseph and hopefully be done with Joseph, which means we're done with Genesis, which means next time we hop into the book of Exodus and talk about Moses freeing the Hebrews from Egypt. Same sources that we almost always use, the Rational Bible, in this case Genesis by Prager. If you want to know who his sources are, and there's a lot of them, they're in the book. And for the translations where I put the verses on the screen, I use Sefaria.org, which is one of Prager's, well, it's the closest one to what Prager uses in his book. In some cases, sometimes there's a little bit of difference, but generally not much, if any. Okay, so here we are in the middle of the Jacob story, or getting close to the end of it. Jacob and his uncle Laban, they're trying to sort of make up a little bit, and Laban has been misleading him and teasing him and various sorts of things like that. So Jacob leaves to go to where he wants to go in secret, supposedly in the dead of night. And eventually Jacob finds out about it and catches up with him. And this verse here, 31:27, is what Laban asked Jacob when he catches up to him. Why did you flee in secrecy and mislead me and not tell me? I would have sent you off with festive music, with timbrel and lyre. Pretty clearly, he would not have done that. And sometimes the question becomes, you know, when someone lies to you, do they know they're lying to you? In this case, at least Prager is pretty sure that Jacob did know. Certainly God knew, if that is true, and we think it is. The text gives us no clue whether or not Jacob thought he was lying or not. And the analyzation, you might say, of lies and liars is a morally significant thing. If you don't know that what you're saying isn't true, then you're simply making an error. It's not. We're not talking about the you don't lie kind of sin. What you need to do, of course, is just make it right, correct what it is you said or wrote wrong, and then that's fine. On the other side of the coin, though, there are plenty of people who do lie intentionally, and there are folks that do that almost habitually. In fact, the more you do it, the more you tend to keep doing it. It becomes natural, and the lies progress from being innocuous to deadly in some cases, depending on what it is you're talking about. So, and one of the things when you're lying over and over and over is your brain can adapt to being dishonest. It becomes like you don't even know that you're being dishonest, which may have been what was happening with Jacob here. Eventually, the liar doesn't believe he is ever lying, and therefore there's no reason to apologize, no reason to correct anything. And ultimately, this is how people can lie in the name of a cause with self-impunity. They are so sure they are right. They'll lie knowing full well that what they're saying is a lie just to crush the opposition, or at least put them down. And Prager points out at some length, going through list after list of big lies that have been the world's greatest source of evil over the history of humanity, really. And one last thought on lying. Part of the liar's punishment is that not only does he cease being believed, but he cannot believe anyone else, even when they're telling him the truth. So all that out of a little bit of lie that Jacob told. But it's an important thing, and it's a topic that Genesis covers over and over and over. So in chapter 32, which we just now hopped into, Jacob returns to the land of Esau, and he was afraid of what Esau might do. And he says in 32:12, "Deliver me, I pray." This is Jacob talking to God. From the hand of my brother Esau, from the hand of Esau, that's right there. "Else I fear he may come and strike me down, mothers and children alike." The question is, why would he fear that? God promised Jacob long. The issue of fearing God is a much bigger one, and I don't want to cover that here. But what I do want to share from the Prager book here is everyone has crises of faith. This you could call a crisis of faith. Maybe Jacob isn't quite so sure that God will protect him as much as he said or indicated he would. There's nothing new or wrong about that. It's perfectly human. Even those who had direct contact with God in these Genesis stories, and later on in Exodus too, had doubts. For us to never doubt would what would it take? It would take a God who would have to make himself known to us at all times. And at that point, the word faith would basically become meaningless. It's a perfectly natural thing to have crises of faith, or a lot of people call it doubt. Have doubts on one topic or another, or generally. Okay, so a little bit more intrigue between Jacob and Esau. Jacob is going on before we get to this verse. Jacob crossed a river to get away from Esau, and that's kind of a big deal in 3,600 years ago, getting you and your herd and family, whatever, across a river. So it's significant. When Jacob is finally alone, he wrestles with a man overnight. And the wrestler, we come to know, is an angel. And he says, "Your name shall no longer be Jacob," this is the angel talking, "but Israel, for you have striven with beings divine and human and have prevailed." That striven with beings and divine and human refers to struggling, which is what the name Israel means, struggle with God. And as we all know, it's through this new name that the Israelites become the Israels. The people of the Hebrews become the Israelites because of the naming of renaming of Jacob Israel. In this wrestling that goes on and on, the angel wrenches Jacob's hip and then says, "Let me go." And Jacob says, "Not till you bless me." And Jacob must have realized that he was wrestling with God's angel. Throughout the Torah, it is made abundantly clear that you are expected to struggle with God. It's not just okay to struggle with God, it's actually required. It's almost kind of like a sign of, if you ignore me or just kind of passively sort of speak, believe in me, you might as well totally ignore me. I would rather we work things out sort of approach. And from God's point of view, or from looking at it above it all, if you will, reading this. How could God expect man to not struggle with him, given the fact that God gave man the capacity to think, the capacity to reason, all that good stuff. And it's not like he's around all the time so that you don't have to have faith to know that he's there. It just makes sense. And not everything is clear as crystal. So, of course you're going to struggle with him periodically. If you don't, if you are absolutely certain of what you are about and what you believe in, that's the sort of thing that leads to fanaticism. You are just so sure that you are right and what you think is right, that can get you in trouble. A little more humility, a little more struggling perhaps would be a better thing. It's also true that we struggle with our parents, right? Sometimes, most of us did probably. So why not with your Heavenly Father would be a good way to look at this kind of struggle. And if you happen to be a secular Jew, which I don't think we have anyone here who is, but God is telling secular Jews too that they must struggle with their atheism or agnosticism too, if that's where they're at. Okay, so eventually, finally, in chapter 33, Jacob and Esau meet and embrace. They basically make up. And it could be one of those things that time heals all wounds, but not entirely, because by the end of the chapter, they each go their separate ways. So here's a little side story in chapter 34, before we get to Joseph. The rape of Dinah, who was Jacob's daughter, a guy named Shechem, I think that's how you say it, took her forcefully, and then in the story in chapter 34 talks to her real lovey-dovey like. And if this should ring some bells in anyone who's familiar with rape cases and how they function, or that sort of thing. It's a common practice of men. They take a woman forcefully and then talk sweet afterwards, as if, well, a number of things could be at play. They don't want her to turn him in. Maybe he really did come to love her after the fact. Maybe he didn't want her to seek revenge. Most societies back in this time that we're talking about, 3,600 years ago, or them, considered it okay to rape people from another tribe or clan. So it's entirely possible, and these are two separate clans that we're talking about here, the two people. So it's entirely possible he didn't think this was even a bad thing. Prager points out that the name Shechem means son of a donkey, which is kind of a funny, behaving like a jackass that he is. Anyway, so Hamor, who that's Hamor, Hamor makes a deal with Shechem's dad to exchange daughters, to sort of have Shechem make good on his taking this woman, and then Jacob gave a daughter to one of his sons. But it also involved Hamor's tribe all having to be circumcised. That was a requirement that Jacob put on the deal. So they basically had this issue settled, you might say, but then two of Jacob's sons go out to get revenge for the rape of their sister and slaughter the innocents in the town of Hamor and Shechem, which was obviously a big deal, and Jacob was incensed by it, no doubt, but he doesn't actually condemn these two sons for that until his deathbed, which comes a little later. So God sends Jacob to Bethel and instructs him to build an altar there. And the reason I point this out in chapter 35, Jacob is the only patriarch that is instructed to build an altar and do a sacrifice. All the other patriarchs built altars on their own. So what's one of the important things about these altars and sacrifices to God and all that stuff? Well, Prager points out that probably the most, or one of the most important things is being grateful. And these are physical reminders of what you're being grateful for or to whom you're being grateful. Gratefulness takes effort. On the other hand, resentment of something that bad happened to you kind of lives on naturally in your head. It's kind of too bad that those are reversed like that. And at this point here too, the other significant thing about this happening, this is where God himself tells Jacob that his new name is Israel. The first time you recall was with the angel or the messenger. So the new name Israel is solidified, you might say. So Jacob tells his family to get rid of all their idols. They're going to move on. Rachel, his beloved Rachel, dies giving birth to his last son, and she names him Ben-Oni, I guess would be the way to pronounce it, which means in Hebrew, son of mourning, as in being in mourning when someone dies. And Jacob eventually changes that name to Benjamin, and we all know Benjamin coming up in the story of Joseph. So probably because he didn't want to saddle his name with a constant reminder of his mother's passing, either his own reminder of that or Benjamin's remembering that. Eventually, Isaac and his sons Jacob and Esau are buried together. Esau was not a bad guy. We learn more about Esau in chapter 36, which was also one of the reasons, other than being complete, you might say, that chapter 36 is all dedicated to the line of Esau, was to make it clear that he was not a bad guy. Included in the story of conversion to Judaism by a concubine, Timnah, the patriarchs discouraged her, but Timnah wanted to convert. And the gist of that story is it's made clear to the Jews that they should not discourage anyone from converting. So if there's any doubt in your mind whether Jews accept converts, this should settle that matter. Okay, so now we're getting more into Joseph. We're at chapter 37, the third verse. Now Israel loved Joseph best of all his sons. Not great parenting. It's one thing to take your one of 11 sons or 12 sons, whatever it is, aside and make him happy and everything, but to treat him so well in the obvious sight of the other brothers and give him things you don't give the others, and including fancy colored coats, it's just not good parenting. That's one of the things about the Torah too. All of these Jewish families, almost from the get-go down through, are not by any means perfect families. Most of them are what we would call dysfunctional families. They break up, they feud, they fight. Cain kills Abel, all that stuff. The Torah is very real about life then, teaching us lessons that apply to life today just as much. And this eventually, of course, leads to him being sold off into slavery because the brothers were so upset with him. Let's see, do I have anything else here? Oh, this is another good point too. We seem to learn only from our own mistakes. We could learn so much more, so much faster if we could learn to do as well in terms of learning from mistakes of others. But as you'll see in this story, Jacob never learns not to treat Joseph and Benjamin better. In the in this verse, he refers to his child of his old age being Joseph, but we now know that Benjamin is actually the youngest of the brothers. But he may well have chosen Joseph to shower the favor upon, at least for now, because Benjamin reminded him too much of Rachel, and he just couldn't deal with it. And in the next verse, and when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of his brothers, they hated him so that they could not speak a friendly word to him. The word friendly in this verse in the Hebrew is a word you all probably know, shalom, which would be better translated as peace, like I can't speak a peaceful word to him. And this is what's pointed out here is that the brothers and Joseph never really confront each other. They don't talk with each other. And this leads basically to demonization of each other. The brothers have one set of thoughts about Joseph that are never challenged by Joseph or anybody else. And Joseph has a certain feeling about his brothers that is also never challenged. He doesn't learn to sort of back off with his... when this all started at the beginning of the Joseph story with Joseph snitching on the brothers. So he's not helping matters either. So this notion of staying apart, not speaking a peaceful word to each other, leads to this demonization, and they plot to kill or sell him off, or whatever they hope to do, without even seeing what he's all about or talking to him. So Joseph has the first of his dreams, and it's the one with the sheaves and the seven sheaves, or 10 sheaves bow down to the one. Get lost in the numbers here. The first of Joseph's dreams seems to need no interpretation. It's basically the brothers are bowing down to him. And the brothers did not take that well, as it records here in 37:8. His brothers answered, "Do you mean to reign over us? Do you mean to rule over us?" And they hated him even more for his talk about his dreams. This, to some degree, this foreshadows the worldwide hatred of the Jews as the chosen, which I think we're going to talk about a little later on. But whatever's going on here, hatred has a lot to do with it. This is the third time in 5 verses that the brothers' hatred of Joseph is noted. Another thing that turns dreams into something more than just dreams back in the day was that a single dream all by itself was not really thought of as very important. But if there were 2 dreams, a pair of dreams, either you yourself have the same dream 2 nights in a row, or you and someone else have very similar, if not the same dreams, the same night, now all of a sudden it's taken much more seriously by these ancients, the folks at this time. So Joseph has a second dream. Now it's important. And it's going to get even more frustrating. The second dream has the sun and the moon bowing down to his sheaves as well, which includes not only the brothers, but his parents. And Joseph made the mistake, perhaps, of sharing this dream with his father as well as with his brothers, who, not surprisingly, got mad about it. 37:10, and when he told it to his fathers and brothers, his father berated him. You on the ground. He was not pleased with this. Maybe he thought, Jacob thought that his favorite son has now finally gotten out of control. Or maybe he was to bow down to him. Another interesting thing about this verse, these kinds of questions that pop up if you really dive down into it. He says, and I and your mother and your brothers bow low to the ground. But his mother, Rachel, is dead. How is that? Well, dreams can do interesting things, right? You can almost do anything you want in a dream. Maybe your mother is referring to Bilhah, the servant of the family who raised Joseph as his mother after Rachel died. His brothers were envious, clearly. A better translation for their reaction was wrought up. And this gets to the notion of envy being a poison. Festering anger is poison. Hence the quote, "You shall not hate your brother in your heart." Otherwise, the anger becomes toxic. Either the answer, of course, being either let it go or express it appropriately, but don't let it fester. Just another one of the lessons of the book. So, Jacob sends Joseph out to find his brothers to see if they can make peace. Here's Dad trying to make Joseph and the brothers make peace. It may not be something that it's a good idea for Dad to get involved with, but he does anyway. Often that kind of involvement with nearly grown sons doesn't work. So anyway, Joseph goes off to hunt for them. He doesn't know where the brothers are with their flock. And he finds someone to ask. And without describing his brother or what was with him or anything, the man tells Joseph, "Oh, you can find them in Dothan." D-O-T-H-A-N. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it. Joseph never directly speaks with God throughout this whole process. But there are certainly many coincidences in his life that occur, like this stranger, who clearly must have been told or intervened with somehow. The hand of God is at work. With Joseph not describing anything about who he's looking for, the guy tells him right where they are. So this lets us talk a little bit about the hand of God and when you see it and when you don't. And it's interesting, whether you see God or coincidence, that seems to be the two choices. Was that God really working, or was that just purely a coincidence that he knew right where those brothers were? What you see there is basically up to you. What we don't get to choose is what happens to us, but we do get to choose how we react. Do we sense that that's the hand of God, or do we think that's just a coincidence? You choose to be happy, you probably will be. If you choose to be mad, you probably will be. Choose to live in a God-centered way, and you'll ultimately have faith, if not at the beginning. So the brothers see Joseph coming from afar, and they plot to kill him. And the older brother says, says not to kill him directly, but leave him in a pit. So they put him in a pit, and then they sit down to a meal. I mean, that's pretty callous. They throw him in a pit and then go have a meal around the campfire or whatever. They do think of selling him to the Ishmaelites, but when the Ishmaelites come here in 37:28, actually it wasn't the Ishmaelites, it was the Midianites. When the Midianite traders passed by, they pulled Joseph out of the pit. They sold Joseph for 20 pieces of silver to the Ishmaelites, who brought Joseph to Egypt. So the key part of the story here is the brothers did not sell Joseph into slavery. They left him in the pit and went to go have a meal. When they came back, he wasn't there. The Midianites had found him and pulled him up out of the pit, and the Midianites sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites, who in turn took Joseph to Egypt. And then following this event, when all of a sudden Joseph was gone, the brothers had to return home to Daddy Jacob, and as the story goes, they took the blood of a lamb or sheep and covered his tunic, that Joseph's Technicolor dream coat, quote unquote, and convinced Jacob that he had been attacked by animals, which is what well, they didn't so much convince him as they handed him the tunic with the blood, and they let him think that that's what happened. His father mourned him, of course, and he, like his brothers, although they didn't tell him exactly the same story, but they all really don't know what happened to him at this point. Jacob believes, or jumped to a conclusion that turns out not to be true. The brothers know in fact it's not true, but they don't really know what it was that did happen to him. And this is how Joseph finally comes to the home of Potiphar in Egypt. This is a little break in the story in chapter 38 where Judah, one of Joseph's brothers, finds a wife in Canaan, which is a no-no to Jacob and his family. You're not to take Canaanite wives. But he did, and he had 3 sons, Onan, and Shelah. E-R is the way it's spelled, married a woman, Tamar, but for some reason God took him. It's all it says is for something displeasing, God took him. It doesn't ever say what it was. So because God took Tamar's new husband, and in tradition then, Onan should have married Tamar, the next oldest brother, mostly for her sake, to make sure that she had a man to protect her, and the family line could be semi-protected as well. But Onan didn't do that, and in a sense cheated everybody. Another deception, you might say. In fact, Prager says there are so many deceptions in Genesis, they probably should have called it the Book of Deception rather than Genesis. It's kind of amazing. But anyway, so then Tamar acts in order to stay with the family, quote unquote, or the family genes, you might say. Tamar, the wife who lost a son and didn't get the second one, acts like a prostitute to cohabitate with Judah, another one of the sons. And how Judah didn't recognize her is kind of another mystery that's never really solved, except to speculate a bit. But he gives her some tokens of his, which she later reveals to someone else to save her life, when she's accused of being a prostitute. No, I wasn't, blah, blah, blah. And she has twins through Judah. And now this is where it becomes really important. It's these twins, and Tamar and Judah, who share in the lineage leading to King David, who we all know shares in the lineage to the Messiah, and to Jesus. It's really fascinating how not necessarily the greatest people behaving in the greatest of ways end up being part of the story here, part of God's plan. One of the main points here is, remember I told you Tamar was Canaanite. The Hebrews weren't supposed to marry Canaanites, but they did. So they mixed these national identities. The point here is, it's not national identities that matter, it's values. If you have the same set of values, great. I don't care about what nationalities are in the mix. As opposed to, we all have to be the best national identity, and we're not going to think too much of anybody else. So that little story is in here. I'll give you a little bit more clue. Okay, so Joseph is ultimately sold to Potiphar, who is a key person in the Pharaoh's court, and he becomes very successful. And Prager points out here that Joseph's life cycle, you might say, of being persecuted in the pit, and then very successful in life, and then persecuted, being thrown in jail, and then being very successful with Pharaoh, and so on and so forth, is a paradigm of the whole Jewish experience. They're persecuted, then they're successful wherever they are. They're persecuted again, often in times because they did do so There was a lot of envy involved and so on. Success, again, it's the same pattern. And often that success was in foreign lands, just like Joseph's was. He was a foreigner to Egypt, but he becomes very successful. Let's see, where are we? Okay, so one day, Potiphar's wife comes to Joseph, and notice that, as the one verse says, he was well built and handsome or something like that, and basically says, lie with me. And we're not quite sure if she actually was asking for sex or she just wanted to lay down for an hour or whatever. But in other words, in any way, he refuses. And this was the first clue of Joseph's righteousness, which is ultimately why we see God using Joseph. We don't know about his righteousness at the beginning of the story like we did with some. We knew Noah was a righteous man right at the beginning of the story. We learn about Joseph's righteousness as we go along here. Another clue is the saving of Egypt, which were foreigners to him. He saved others. He saved the stranger. And the third clue about Joseph's righteousness was that he honored God. He did what seemed to be asking of him, and would honor God in places like this where he could not sin before God, even if Potiphar's wife wanted it. He couldn't do it. So, in a number of ways throughout the story, he shows his righteousness. Potiphar ultimately imprisons Joseph over this event. He could have killed him. So there's some speculation as to why he just threw him in prison as opposed to off with his head. One of the reasons given is that Potiphar might not have believed his wife, because the wife made up the story. Remember, Joseph refused, but Potiphar's wife has a garment that Joseph left behind, shows it to his servant, who shows it to Potiphar, and he is led to believe that Joseph took her, quote unquote. But mainly because of the light punishment, there's probably good odds that Potiphar didn't really believe his wife altogether. So in chapter 40, we find two people joining Joseph in prison. Pharaoh is angry with his two courtiers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and threw them into prison. We don't know what their offense was, but the chief cupbearer is another way to, the more direct translation of the Hebrew is officer in charge of drinks. And I thought to myself, now there's a job. I'll be the officer in charge of drinks. And the baker was clearly a very important person too. Bread was a staple. Egypt is widely regarded as the inventor of bread. And each of these two have a dream. 40, verse 8. And they said to him, we had dreams, and there is no one to interpret them. So Joseph said to them, surely God can interpret. Tell me your dreams. Joseph recognizes God as the source of his talent. It's not I who am going to tell your dreams. It is God who is going to interpret these dreams. Another clue to Joseph's righteousness, by the way. And to tend to one of these things, recognizing God as where your talents come from, as opposed to yourself, is gratitude. Remember, we had an earlier story that sort of spoke to this gratitude notion. Gratitude leads to much greater things. For example, great composers credited God literally on their scores when they wrote this glorious music from 200, 300, 400, 800 years ago, as opposed to, I suspect, today's secular music is really only written to glorify themselves. The problem is that shows. So Joseph acts to, we skipped right over all the dreams and interpretations. I'm hoping they're relatively familiar to him. You know, the one dreams of 7 fat cows and 7 lean cows, and the 7 eat the fat cows. And the other has 7 great ears of corn and 7 scrawny ears of corn, and the scrawny ears of corn eat the, or no, the scrawny ears of corn eat the short one, and the birds peck off his head and all that stuff. When Joseph finally interprets the dreams, I'm sorry, that was the wrong dream. That was Joseph's dream for Pharaoh. The cupbearer and the chief baker had 2 dreams that ultimately had the cupbearer living, basically, and the chief baker dying. So after he tells them all this sort of thing, and they leave the jail to be taken away to be restored in the case of the cupbearer, or executed in the case of the baker, Joseph says to the cupbearer, "Think of me when all is well with you again, and do me the kindness of mentioning me to Pharaoh, so as to free me from this place." This is Joseph acting to help himself. And one of the messages here is we cannot rely on miracles. We should do everything in our power to improve our situation ourselves. There's a great story about a man on a roof during a flood who is waiting for someone to come help him, but he knows God will save him. And a man shows up in a boat, and the guy says, no, God will save me, I'm okay. And then pretty soon a policeman comes along in a power boat, and the guy says, no, God will save me. And then a helicopter comes along, and the guy waves him off, no, God will save me. And of course, the floodwaters come and finally overtake the man, and he drowns. And when he goes up to heaven, he says, God, why didn't you help me? And God says, well, I sent you a man in a boat and a policeman and a helicopter. You didn't take advantage of it. And yet the chief bearer did not think of Joseph. He forgot him. That's verse 23 in chapter 40. One of the points here, memory must be kept alive. Remember, we talked about that's why the altars and the patriarchs and sacrifice, a lot of the Jewish rituals and traditions have to do with keeping memories of their history alive. Otherwise, we become ungrateful. We don't remember all the good that's been done with us. People make generous promises to those who can help them, but then don't follow through when they get helped. It's sort of sad that we do that as mankind. It's a kind of a natural urge towards evil. We talked about urges once before. But you have to make a deliberate effort to remember. Holidays, rituals, teaching history. Much of today's problems, Prager would point out, in America may stem from ungrateful people who have no knowledge of history. So here we go again, 41:16. Joseph answers Pharaoh, "It won't be me who interprets your dream, not I. God will see to Pharaoh's welfare." So here's the 7 cows and fat cows, 7 lean cows, 7 strong ears, 7 short ears. And here's where the interpretation comes, will be 7 years of abundance, followed by 7 years of famine. So no sooner does Joseph get done interpreting the dream, he stops interpreting, and he starts giving Pharaoh advice. 41:33, accordingly, let Pharaoh find a man. This is Joseph talking to Pharaoh. Let Pharaoh find a man of discernment and wisdom and set him over the land of Egypt. Well, if that isn't something, I mean, you have to believe here that Joseph is getting more than a little confidence going. And the Pharaoh was receptive to it. Leaders like solutions. Pharaoh was a good leader. He put his people's needs before his own. He believed Joseph because the dream was big. It was about his country. It wasn't just about him. I can imagine all the other soothsayers and magicians who probably offered interpretations of the dream, but they weren't big enough. They weren't macro enough. Which is probably altogether different from the Pharaoh that 100 years hence, becomes the Pharaoh over the Egyptians, under whom Moses leads them out of Egypt. Okay, so before the 7 years of abundance were up, Joseph has two sons. Firstborn Manasseh, meaning God has made me forget completely my hardship and my parental home. Holy cow, that's a lot of meaning in one short little word. But it's an excellent little lesson. In your personal life, it is often good to forget. Particularly painful things that would otherwise nag at you for a lifetime. Prager would suggest, for instance, that the notion of using psychologists or whatever to search for recovered memories is crazy. You should let that stuff go. A new child of your own often helps you do that. And maybe that's why he put such meaning into the name of one of his boys. Okay, moving right along. Okay, so we have Joseph who has taken over second command basically in Egypt, and he's controlling collecting the abundance of the land for 7 years, and then the famine comes. And not only is Egypt having problems with the famine, but so is the land of the Hebrews. So Jacob sends the brothers to Egypt to acquire some food. And here in 42:6 and 7, now Joseph was the vizier of the land. It was he who dispensed rations to all the people. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed low to him with their faces to the ground. When Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he acted like a stranger toward them and spoke harshly to them. A lot of things are happening here. First of all, remember in Joseph's first set of dreams, the family would bow down to him. Well, here's at least most of the family fulfilling that part of that dream. Why did he speak harshly to them? What was the problem? Well, a couple of things come to Prager's mind, which I'm sharing. Joseph may have wanted to find out if his brothers had changed at all. Had they become any better people? And so he was making sure they didn't recognize him, and he was basically plotting a test, which we'll see unfold here in a bit. And he might have been doubly worried about had the brothers repented at all, because Benjamin was missing. Remember, or maybe I didn't mention, in the story you need to remember that Benjamin remained home with his father Jacob while the other brothers went to Egypt to get the supplies. So it could be either way. But in any case, Joseph is going to put them to the ringer in terms of test. So the first test, if you will, has to do with spying, it was only a ruse. It really had nothing to do with spying. Joseph sends the brothers home and say, don't come back here without Benjamin. That's the only way you can prove to me that you're not a spy. What we're getting at here, what Joseph is trying to get at is, are the brothers going to treat Benjamin just like he treated Joseph when given that opportunity, or not? Which is to say, are they going to repent, meaning they don't treat Benjamin the same way they treated Joseph, or are they not going to repent, which means under the same situation would they sin again? During all this conversation, remember, Joseph is very Egyptian now, speaking Egyptian. He's using an interpreter between he and his brothers. So they have no reason to suspect that this is his brother at all. But that means that Joseph can overhear what the brothers are talking about, and they have no idea that he understands. During a discussion, this in 23-24, they did not know that Joseph understood, for there was an interpreter between him and them. Thus you shall be put to the test. Unless your youngest brother comes here by Pharaoh, you shall not depart from this place. He turned away from them and wept. Why did he weep? Well, one thing is, while the brothers were talking and they didn't think Joseph was understanding them, he hears that Reuben tried to save him. I mean, you can't make up this drama. It would be a fantastic story just to put on the stage. After all the pain and suffering, this is the first time the Torah notes that and why not? He heard guilt and remorse on the part of his brother. Maybe this is going to go my way, so to speak, with his test of whether or not they are really repentant or not. And basically just reconnecting with family under most any circumstances brings a certain amount of joy, sometimes overwhelming. So he sends the brothers back under this ruse that I need to see Benjamin, otherwise I'm going to think you're spies. And Simeon remains in Egypt as a hostage, basically, to make sure that they come back somehow or another. Jacob is told here, but he said, my son must not go down with you, for his brother is dead and he alone is left. This is Jacob talking to the brothers, saying, no, I'm not going to let you take Benjamin back to Egypt. And if he meets with disaster on the journey you're taking, you will send my white head down to Sheol in grief. Sheol being like the bottom depths of practically hell sort of thing. Reuben tries to talk Jacob into allowing Benjamin to go back, because if he doesn't go back with them, they're not going to get some food and presumably perish. But Judah then in the next chapter, 43, all of a sudden Judah is the spokesman for the brothers, not Reuben. And he convinces Jacob that it's either starve to death or send Benjamin. That's really your only two choices. And Jacob ends up saying, take your brother and go. He can't even say the name Benjamin. Or he might have used the word, another possibility is he might use the word brother, take your brother and go, to remind the other brothers that you have a responsibility here, a brotherly responsibility to keep track of Benjamin and make sure he gets back. So the brothers with Benjamin go back to back to Egypt and see Joseph, and Joseph throws a big dinner party, and they in 43:32 they served him by himself, meaning Joseph by himself, and them by themselves, the brothers, the Hebrews, and the Egyptians who ate with him by themselves. So there's three groups here. There's Joseph all by himself, there's the Hebrews on one side, and the Egyptians on the other, because the Egyptians could not dine with the Hebrews, since that would be abhorrent to the Egyptians. National superiority is an amazing thing. Every group in history has considered themselves exalted. And here's an example of the Egyptians considering them exalted. They couldn't even begin to think about the idea of eating with the Hebrews. This ultimately leads to a theme, and often explicitly stated in the Torah, about love the stranger. You must learn to see yourself in others that don't happen to look or talk like you, perhaps. You think because they don't look or talk like you or behave like you that they aren't as real as you are. But they do have the same feelings, the same worries, the same dreams, the same aspirations. We just don't naturally sense it necessarily. And this has happened throughout history. Every group, every nation, everyone generally thinks they're the cat's meow. It leads to a belief or thought that racism is partly natural. That it's, some people say, well, look at the baby. They don't care whether you're black or white. Well, it's a baby. By the time you grow up and some of your real adult natural tendencies come out, I think it's fair to say that racism is part of it. You don't necessarily see yourself in others. And this extends, by the way, to male-female relationships. Males, by and large, consider females strangers. They don't have any clue how that thing is behaving. And females, vice versa. This is partly why marriage is so important. Marriage is part of the love the stranger law. And in this case, the stranger being the other sex. You need the most important person in your life, the one that you marry, your spouse, is not a blood relative. Blood is not the most important thing. It's learn to love the stranger and how the two of you, whether it's male, female in a spousal relationship or country in some sort of a cooperative effort, learn to complement each other. There was in chapter 44, from verse 18 all the way through 34, is the most amazing speech by Judah, who pleads with Joseph following the final test. They find Benjamin has the stolen cup that he didn't steal. Of course, Joseph had it put in his bag. Joseph threatens to enslave Benjamin forever. And Judah steps to the fore and delivers the most amazing plea that shows a lot of humility. There's no lies in it. The 18 through 34, the word father, meaning Jacob, the reference back to Jacob, is made 14 times in that number of verses. The word servant is used, meaning we are your servant, Joseph, 13 times. Judah recapitulates Jacob favoring Benjamin and how much harm that did. Joseph learns what his father was told of his disappearance in this speech, the blood-covered cloak and so on. And ultimately, at the tail end of the speech, Judah says, therefore, please let your servant, meaning me, Judah, let your servant remain as a slave to my Lord instead of the boy, Benjamin, and let Benjamin go back with his brothers. For how can I go back to my father unless the boy is with me? Let me not be witness to the woe that would overtake my father. This is an interesting, remember we talked about the fact that what goes around comes around a lot in the Torah. Well, at the beginning we have Judah basically sending Joseph off to be a slave in Egypt. And now Judah is offering himself to be a slave to Joseph. What goes around comes around. But it's very clear to Joseph that they're not going to let this all ride on Benjamin. They desperately need to take him home to his dad. They're not going to repeat what which is considered a higher level of Jewish behavior than being good all along. If you are bad and become good, that's actually better than being good all along. And as you might imagine, Joseph, chapter 45, verse 1, Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, have everyone withdraw from me. So there was no one else about when Joseph made himself known to his brothers, which he does do in 45, verse 3. And they were dumbfounded, as you might well imagine, shocked, speechless, probably. Joseph tells his brother in their language. Remember, there's no all the rest of the Egyptians were just told to vamoose, and Joseph tells his brother in Hebrew, no doubt, I am your brother Joseph. A very famous line. I don't know. I didn't remember this being such a famous line, but it's well known. I am your brother Joseph. And one of the things that happened with that line was Pope John the 23rd, who was born with Joseph as his name, but they renamed the Pope in this case to John. But he was born as Joseph. After all the Jewish Catholic feuding and fussing and the Catholic persecution of the Jews, he goes to a meeting to rectify this, to bring reconciliation and so on. And he opens the meeting to all these Jewish leaders saying, I am your brother Joseph. it's one of the most powerful things you can imagine once you understand what this story is about and what that was about, and being penitent. So anyway, all is well. Whoops, sorry about that. I lost my jump. All is well. Joseph sends the brothers home to tell his father to return to Egypt, which of course Jacob wants to do. He learns that his son is alive. He wants to see him. Ultimately, Jacob and his family settle in a land called Goshen, which is Egyptian, at the Pharaoh's bidding. That's how good a Pharaoh this Pharaoh was. He said to Joseph, make sure they get the best land, the best this, the best that. And this, basically, this move then ultimately of Jacob and his family to Goshen, which is in the land of Egypt, this is how the Israelites came to be in Egypt. Jacob dies. Joseph is at his side as God promised. I'm leaving out a whole bunch of fascinating stuff here, but we're kind of running out of time. Jacob was buried in Canaan. And you may recall there was a big deal made of when Abraham purchased the land in Canaan to bury, I forget who, but somebody and other family members. So that's where Jacob was taken to be ultimately buried. But the brothers, the whole family, returned back to Egypt where they settled, and now in Joseph's and Pharaoh's good graces. This has been some real reconciliation. And Joseph dies. So, now we're set up for the Exodus about 400 years hence. And that's what we'll be talking about next week. Let me turn the microphones back on, see if anybody has any. Okay, I think any questions? Ooh. Okay, well, none, we'll call the evening complete, and we will see you on the 22nd, where we jump into the Exodus, the book of Exodus, and the story of Moses. All right, thanks for joining us all.
Thanks, Jamie.
Thank you.
Thank you. Guys. Take care.
All righty. Bye-bye.
Bye now.